Criminal justice revolves around the moral that criminals should be punished for their crimes. It's a moral shared by most people in the world. If someone walking on the street decides to shoot someone else, they should suffer the due consequences. But what if the criminal was mentally insane? While it is morally wrong to perform a crime like murder, the accused may not have been able to differentiate the right from the wrong. It can sometimes be morally wrong to even send them to prison with their mental condition. So in modern day, people in this situation can avoid being imprisoned by using the insanity plea. The insanity plea is one of the least used pleas in the court of law, yet it's managed to cause a lot of controversy. To truly understand the insanity plea, let's go back and look at its evolution. In ancient times, insanity was a way to mitigate a sentence, but not to fully escape it. People never considered it a way to get out of punishments of a crime, until 1843, when Daniel Mcnaughton, an English woodturner, shot and killed Edward Drummond, the secretary to the British Prime Minister. Mcnaughton was a delusional Englishman who was convinced that people in a conservative party in the United Kingdom were conspiring against him, and that he was being constantly followed by spies. So he set out to assassinate the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, but he mistakenly shot Edward Drummond in the back. Mcnaughton went into his trial backed by a phenomenal defense team. They argued that his delusions led him to a breakdown of moral sense, which kept him from controlling his actions. Ultimately, the verdict was not guilty by reason of insanity. Though he never went to jail, he spent the rest of his life in an insane asylum at Bethlehem Hospital. Tons of people, including Queen Victoria, were not pleased with the not guilty verdict. To clarify the law concerning the use of not guilty by reason of insanity plea, Mcnaughton's rule was written. It states, "To establish a defense on the ground of insanity, it must be clearly proved that, at the time of committing the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind, as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know that what he was doing was wrong." Basically, in order to use the plea of insanity, the person who committed the crime must not have known what they were doing, or what the effect of their actions would be due to their mental illness. In the late 19th century, the field of psychology began to change and develop as new theories about the causes and cures of insanity were developed. Medical professionals started more research into the field of mental illness, and it was evident that Mcnaughton's law needed to be revised. One theory concerning the insane people was that people would have uncontrollable impulses. So, the irresistible impulse test was created, saying that the law should not only acquit a person not knowing an act was wrong, but should also acquit one who was unable to prevent themselves from committing the act despite knowledge of the wrongfulness. The major flaw of this law was the fact that all humans, insane or not, have impulses. But society tells us that we just need to control them. Despite its flaws, the test was added on to the Mcnaughton rule in many states. In the 1950s, psychology gained a lot of interest with the return of World War II veterans. This included government interest and brought a lot of attention to the subject of mental disorders. Monte Durham was a 23-year-old man who had already spent time in mental institutions and jail since the time he was 17. In 1953, although his lawyer tried to show that he was insane, Durham was convicted of housebreaking. But when his attorney appealed the case, the federal judge took the case as an opportunity to modernize the insanity plea and do away with the Mcnaughton rule and the irresistible impulse test. The new Durham rule said that a person was not criminally responsible if the unlawful act was a product of mental disease or defect. Two questions needed to be answered to show that a defendant was insane under this rule. One was saying if the defendant had a mental disease or defect. The second was if that defect was the reason for that particular crime. This method was ultimately rejected by courts because it was too broad, allowing people with problems like drug addiction to avoid conviction for crimes related to their addiction. The Model Penal Code, or the MPC, was created by the American Law Institute in 1962 to cover all the holes that had been present in the other rules. the legally insane individual must have been diagnosed with a mental defect by a psychologist, and either had to be ignorant of the difference between right and wrong, or lack the ability to control the impulse of that action. In 1982, John Hinckley attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. In his trial, Hinckley was deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict pushed the people in America to quickly change the insanity defense and limit its use. Congress and half of the states in the U.S. did so.
In 1984, Reagan also signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which decreed that the defendant should be unable to appreciate the nature and quality of the wrongfulness of his acts. The major landmarks in the evolution of the insanity plea were the Mcnaughton rule, the irresistible impulse test, the Durham test, the Model Penal Code, and the tightening up of the federal definition by the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. Most states still to this day use either the Mcnaughton rule, with or without the irresistible impulse test, or the Model Penal Code. Historically, the evolution of the insanity plea has been triggered by either frightening assassination attempts on political figures or breakthroughs in the field of mental health.